We're here to actually talk about books. I know, be shocked. Also, if you can hear anything in the background, Peg is right over here chewing on a bone. Sorry if you hear Frenchy noises at any point. It should just be a given by this point in anything I do. So actually, I'm more here to talk about an author than just like a specific book, and sort of why I love her books, as well as celebrating the debut of her most recent creation. And that is this baby right here. This is The Red Palace, and the author in question is Joseon. This is her third novel that has been published, and it came out just this past Tuesday. In her 3 young adult historical fiction novels that perfectly blend history with murder, Joseon brings to life the Joseon era of Korea through the eyes of female voices that were too often left behind by the annals of history. In case you don't know, the Joseon era of Korea is a fairly large swath of time from the 1390s to about the 1890s. Imagine how much the world changed in just those 500 years. Each of her 3 novels end up orbiting, I suppose you could say, around specific aspects of Joseon era history. And while the stories themselves may be fiction, they're based in usually all too tragic fact. Take, for example, her debut novel here, The Silence of Bones. Set in the year 1800, it's told through the eyes of a damo who is indentured to the investigation bureau and becomes wrapped up in a murder case where the prime suspect ends up being the very investigator that she serves. It's a phenomenal mystery, and all around it, the Joseon is in the grip of thick political tension. Our epicenter here is the violent expulsion of the Catholics from the kingdom of Joseon. Now, as a white Westerner who has no historical ties to Korea in any way, it's hard for me to pass any kind of judgment on the topic. On the one hand, I understand how the religion itself exists as a massive symbol of white colonialism and imperialism, as well as the constant meddling Joseon had to endure from foreign powers who coveted it as part of their own empires. But I can also see why something like Christianity would appeal to a predominantly Confucianist or Neo-Confucianist state. In a kingdom where one's roles were rigidly determined and the disparities between rich and poor and men and women seemed an uncrossable mountain, a religious philosophy built on equality and tolerance would seem appealing and offer comfort to those who were not flourishing under the current system. Now, the expulsion of the Catholics is also known as the Sinew Persecution of 1801, and the sad irony is that it actually had very little to do with the religion itself at all. Functioning almost more like a smokescreen for political machinations to protect her position and power, Grand Queen Dowager Cheongsong's wave of persecution ultimately concluded with several hundred Catholics executed, although, of course, new leaders would later emerge to rebuild the community. Jumping even further into the past, in her sophomore novel, The Forest of Stolen Girls, we go to the year 1426. And this novel puts into very sharp relief the realities of the tensions that still existed between the still fairly young Joseon, again, we kind of starting point around the 1390s, and their great mainland neighbor, the Ming Chinese dynasty. Set on the island of Jeju, the novel's heroine seeks to find her missing investigator father, who had begun to examine the case of girls going missing, seemingly to vanish into thin air, and even one showing up murdered in one of the island's forests. Her brings the horrid practice of kidnapping and shipping off young Korean women to be part of the Chinese emperor's harem, essentially sexual slavery for women who had only the misfortune of being young, considered aesthetically pleasing, and having no social capital with which to bargain for their safety. These women, should they then be lucky enough to escape or return, were considered pariahs, ruined and damaged to the point that some might wonder why they even bothered to return at all. They were stolen girls who returned to a country that treated them more like living ghosts. Now, this was only kind of like, you could almost say like a small start of a fairly major shift that happened with the position of women on the Korean peninsula. The relative freedoms that they experienced, and again relative, in the Goryeo era were so eroded during the Joseon era that by the time that it ended in the 1890s, in its reasonably violent conclusion, i.e. the Japanese showed up, women had become virtually nameless. Amidst the themes of sisterhood and the power of trauma to manipulate memories, her tells the story of what could be called the Joseon era's version of the comfort women and the social impact of such a horrifying practice. Finally, we come to Joseon's most recent work, The Red Palace. Arguably her most bloody novel and featuring her first romance between characters. God love a good little romance. The Red Palace tells the story of a fairly headstrong young palace nurse who teams up with a rather handsome young inspector to solve the murder of 4 women. And this is in the opening of the novel. We get that murder scene, and like I said, this is kind of the bloodiest of her 3 novels. In this case, her orbits everything around a well-known, to Koreans at least, tragic figure of history, Crown Prince Sado. Born Prince Janghun in 1735, Sado is a name which the king bestowed upon his son after the crown prince's tragic death. The name itself means thinking of with great sorrow. Briefly diving into my own personal opinion here, that's fucking ironic. I don't have any kind of historical ties to Korea, so my opinion is of really no value at all. But the king's treatment of his son drives me up the wall with rage and frustration. Perhaps it's because I myself suffered for decades from an abusive parent that King Yongjo's mental, emotional, and manipulative abuse of his son, as recorded in the memoirs of Lady Haegyong as well as other historical documents, cuts me so deeply. As a result, Janghun ended up clearly suffering from severe mental health issues. Now, whether or not anything was also chemical or genetic, as opposed to being a direct result of his father's treatment, I can't say. And as much as I don't want to armchair diagnose the Crown Prince, from the published memoirs of his wife, I think it's pretty clear that Janghun developed crippling anxiety as a direct result of what I'd wager was some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder from his father's manipulation and humiliation tactics. Now, from here, I actually want to quote Junher's own newsletter about the Crown Prince, which I will also link below. I recommend reading it in its entirety, as I think she sums it up fairly nicely. In 1757, the prince attempted suicide by trying to jump into a palace well after getting into a heated fight with his father, and his suicide attempt only outraged the king further. Then, around the same year, the crown prince began to kill. Again, I'd like to reiterate that having mental health problems doesn't make a person dangerous, and there's no way to draw a direct parallel between the prince's mental health problems and his violence, especially as there are several other facts that may have contributed to his violent behavior. But this event took place before there was awareness about mental health and the stigma around it. And so in Lady Haegyong's memoirs, it is suggested that the prince's illness and his pent-up anger at his father is what resulted in the violent acts. In the end, the crown prince was ordered at the age of 27 to step into a rice chest, where he was sealed within by the order of his father. It took 8 days for him to die of starvation. Now, for the rest of his reign, King Yongjo actually banned any mention of Crown Prince Sado, and it was not until Sado's own son, who became King Jongjo, ascended to the throne that the tragedy was really finally acknowledged, because he very boldly said in his first statement, "I am the son of Prince Sado." Now, as I said, these books perfectly blend history with murder. So half the fun is actually the murder mystery, and the murder mysteries themselves become inextricably linked with the bit of history around which the novel is, as I say, kind of orbiting. This is a period of time that I don't think has gotten enough exploration in fiction, at least within the English language. And the topics which Junher specifically turns her gaze to with each novel is one that I think is of maximum interest and even importance when you consider the development of Korea as a peninsula, and at least in terms of South Korea now as a country. Again, noting the fact that I am a dumbass white American and therefore have no real value in my opinion towards how I feel about the history of these novels, I can't say that as a dumbass white American, the history to me is what is the most fascinating. And the way that her writes her novels, you feel like you're there. I also want to say the inclusion of Korean terms and titles and honorifics and everything else within the novels, I find phenomenal. I think it really does a great job in the same way that if you write a book in dialect, you can be far more immersed within the story because you're starting to hear the voices in your head. And in the case of the Korean language, honorifics and titles and everything else are extremely important to it on a linguistic level. Again, because The Red Palace just came out, these are her 3 books that are published for now. However, she is currently working on a novel that I believe is due to release next year or very, very late this year, but I think next year, entitled A Crane Among Wolves. And I'm extremely excited for it as it will likely take place in the late 1400s, early 1500s. I say that because one of the little historical nuggets she's going to be rotating this story around is that of the story of Yeon Sang-gun of Joseon. And Yeon Sang-gun is considered the worst tyrant of the Joseon dynasty. So, I'm very excited to see what she does with that.